My name is Ryan. I'm 30 years old and live in Chicago. I enjoy spending time on Tinder. It's fun to meet new people now and then, but one night I had a date I'll never forget. A night that almost got me killed. I'm sharing this story so no one else falls into the same trap I did. That evening, I matched with a girl named Sophie. She had long red hair and striking green eyes. Her profile said she was 27, and aside from a few pictures, it was pretty simple. We started chatting. She was direct to the point and didn't try too hard to impress. I liked that. After some back and forth, she asked me straight up, "Want to come over for some wine?" Normally, I don't go to someone's place on the first date. But there was something about Sophie that made me feel at ease. Her place wasn't too far, and I figured, what's the worst that could happen? Great, I'll send you my address. Be here around 9. I felt a strange uneasiness, but I ignored it. The house, I arrived at Sophie's place at 9 p.m. It was an old but well-maintained 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood outside the city. Just as I was about to ring the doorbell, the door opened. Sophie stood there, smiling, but she looked different from her pictures. Her skin was paler, her eyes slightly sunken, and there were faint dark circles under them. Still, she gave me a warm smile and said, "Come in." I stepped inside. The house was too quiet. The furniture was old but neat. There was a small coffee table, a couch, and dim lighting. Everything was a little too perfect, like a staged home rather than a lived-in one. "Nice place," I said, breaking the silence. Sophie smiled. "Let's have some wine." She disappeared into the kitchen. I sat on the couch, pulled out my phone, and checked my messages. That's when I realized there was no signal. A chill ran down my spine, but I brushed it off. Sophie returned with 2 glasses of red wine and sat beside me, handing me one. "Hope you like red." I took the glass, bringing it close to my nose. It smelled normal, but something deep inside me screamed, "Don't drink it!" I glanced at Sophie. She lifted her own glass to her lips, but never actually took a sip. I reached for my phone again. No signal. And then I heard it, the sound of breathing. Not mine, not Sophie's. Someone else was in the house, the trap. I froze. The breathing was faint but unmistakable, and it was coming from behind the slightly open kitchen door. I slowly turned my head. The door was cracked open, just enough for someone to be standing behind it. We weren't alone. My mouth went dry. I hadn't taken a sip of my drink. "I thought we'd be alone tonight," I said carefully. Sophie tilted her head and sighed. "Oh, Ryan," she whispered. And then I noticed something. Her wine glass, it was still full. She had pretended to sip. She was lying. There was something in my drink. I placed my glass on the table and stood up. At that moment, the kitchen door creaked open, and someone stepped out. A tall, gaunt man. He was wearing a black hoodie. His face was pale, his eyes empty. But the worst part, he was holding a rope. Sophie didn't move. She just smiled and tilted her head. "Ryan, you really should have had that drink." That was it. I had to get out. Escape. As the man took a step forward, I grabbed the coffee table and shoved it at him. Glass shattered. I ran for the door, but Sophie grabbed my arm, stronger than I expected. "You're not leaving," she whispered. I shoved her hard. She stumbled back. I reached for the door handle. Click. It was locked. Shit. The man lunged at me. I grabbed a lamp from the side table and hurled it at him. He staggered. I had one chance. I kicked the door. Crack. It didn't break. I kicked it again. Crack. The door burst open. I bolted outside. I ran as fast as I could. I could hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't stop. I ran until I reached a main road. A car approached. I waved frantically. The driver stopped, startled. "Help!" I gasped. "Call the police." The return. 10 minutes later, the cops arrived. I led them back to the house, but something was wrong. The front door was wide open, and inside, standing alone in the living room, was Sophie. Just Sophie. No man, no rope, nothing. One of the officers approached her. "Is there anyone else here?" Sophie looked genuinely confused. "No, it's just me. What's going on?" My eyes darted to the kitchen. The door was now completely closed. Silence. The officers searched the house. Every room, even the basement. They found nothing. One of the cops turned to me. "Ryan, are you sure about what you saw?" Sophie looked at me, and then she smiled. That's when I knew. This was a game. A well-planned, practiced game. One they had played before, but no one would believe me. The officers glanced at each other. They were skeptical. Eventually, they told me there was nothing they could do. No crime had been committed. Sophie followed me to the door, her voice sweet. "Ryan, maybe next time you'll stay for the wine." The aftermath. I deleted Tinder that night, but sometimes I get texts from unknown numbers. Just one sentence. "You won't be so lucky next time, Ryan." My name is Emily. I'm 25 years old, living in a small apartment in Brooklyn. Like most people, I browse dating apps from time to time. I wasn't looking for anything serious, just a little fun, maybe some conversation. That's when I matched with Zach. He looked quite handsome and charismatic in his profile. He said he was 28, a designer, and loved hiking. We hit it off pretty quickly. Our conversations were light and easy, covering movies, music, and just general life. After a week of chatting, he suggested we meet up. "I have a great place," he wrote. "Why don't you come over to my place? We can have a few drinks, just a quiet evening." At first, I hesitated. Meeting someone for the first time at their house seemed a bit strange, but he seemed so warm and trustworthy that I agreed. He sent me his address, a house far away from the city, in the middle of the woods. The journey into the unknown. As I drove, the road grew longer and darker. Trees began to surround me, and the night felt heavier. The only lights were the street lamps casting eerie shadows. It was about 9 p.m., and the emptiness of the night made the atmosphere feel unsettling. The house was old, much older than I expected. The windows were covered in moss, the paint peeling off the walls. From the outside, it didn't look terrifying, but there was something off about it. I rang the doorbell, and Zach answered almost immediately, smiling. "Welcome, Emily," he said, his voice warm. "Thanks. So kind of you," I replied, stepping inside. The house was darker than I expected, with only one dim light in the corner. It smelled slightly musty, and the furniture looked ancient. But Zach seemed unbothered by it all. He gestured toward the couch. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, heading toward the kitchen. "Sure, something light," I replied, sitting down on the couch. I took a deep breath. The house felt cold, and something about it made me uneasy. The old furniture and dark corners gave the house a weird vibe. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I was alone with Zach. The first oddities. We chatted for a while, but Soon I noticed a strange creaking sound coming from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but then I heard something else, a thump. "Do you hear that?" I asked, looking up toward the ceiling. Zach paused for a moment, then shrugged. Yeah, it's just the house. Nothing to worry about." But the noise continued, growing louder. I couldn't focus on the conversation anymore. Every creak, every thud, felt like it was coming from somewhere else. Something else. It didn't seem normal. A stranger appears. A few minutes later, Zach came back into the room. But this time there was a man following him. He was older, with pale skin and deep wrinkles. He looked like he hadn't seen the sun in years. "Zach, what's going on here?" the man said, his voice hoarse and harsh. Zach looked startled. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked, panic creeping into his voice. The man stared at me. "What's going on with this girl?" he said, his eyes narrowing. I froze for a second. I'm Emily. Nice to meet you," I said, with a shaky smile. But inside, something felt completely off. Zach's dad didn't smile. He didn't even acknowledge my handshake. "What's she doing here?" he repeated, his tone dark. Zach tried to brush it off. "Dad, it's fine. Emily's just a friend." But the man wasn't having it. His eyes stayed locked on me, as if he could see something I couldn't. The trap is set. The conversation quickly turned uncomfortable. Zach's dad stayed much closer to me than I would have liked, his eyes constantly tracking my every movement. Zach, on the other hand, started retreating to the kitchen more often, leaving me alone with his father. Then, without warning, the older man leaned closer to me. "You're brave. You know that?" he said in a low voice. I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to mask the rising fear in my chest. "You're brave to come here," he muttered again, his voice cold and menacing. I tried to move away, but the tension in the room made me feel trapped. Zach suddenly snapped. "Dad, stop it," he said sharply, but his voice lacked the usual calmness, replaced with something darker. For a moment, everything went silent. Zach's dad's face twisted into something sinister as he stepped forward, blocking my path. Panic surged in my chest. I needed to get out of there. I needed to escape. In that split second, I knew I had to make a move. I didn't have time to think, only to react. I pushed Zach's dad away, using every ounce of strength I had, and bolted for the door. The door wouldn't open. I pulled desperately at the handle, but it was stuck. My heart raced, and the air in the room grew thick with dread. I could hear footsteps behind me, Zach's voice, a sharp command. "You're not leaving." Fear surged through me. I could hear him closing in, but somehow I managed to get the door open just enough to slip through. I ran. I didn't know where, but I knew I had to keep moving. I ran through the dark yard, the trees closing in around me, every branch and shadow an obstacle. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The sound of my own breath was louder than anything else, but still, I felt like something or someone was behind me, closing in. Then, in the distance, I saw headlights. A car. I ran toward it, pushing myself harder, feeling the panic rising. The car came to a stop, and I almost collided with it as I reached the window. "Are you okay?" a woman's voice asked, startled. Please help me," I gasped. "They're after me. Please." Without hesitation, she unlocked the door. I jumped inside as quickly as I could, and the car sped off. I didn't know where we were headed, but I didn't care. The fear in my chest started to subside, replaced with exhaustion. The police arrive. The woman called the police on the way to the nearest station. As soon as we arrived, I was led to a secure area. I was shaken, still trying to process what had happened. My mind was racing, and all I could think about was getting out of there. The police went to Zach's house, but when they arrived, the place was deserted. The house was empty, and there were no signs of Zach or his father. There was just a broken bottle near the back door, but no traces of anyone. Back to the house. A few days later, I decided to return to the house. Something wasn't right, and I needed answers. The police allowed me to go with them, but when we arrived, the house was still abandoned. It felt even colder than before, the silence thicker. There was no sign of Zach, no sign of his father, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The house felt like a trap, even without them there. It was like the darkness of the place was alive, following me. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was still being hunted. I left the house that day, but the fear never quite left me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I see the house in the woods, and I know one thing for sure. I barely escaped with my life. My name is Jake. I'm 28 years old and live in New York. I've met many people through Tinder, but until now, I had never truly felt fear. That was before I met Lori. I'm sharing this story so that no one else makes the same mistake I did. That day, I was mindlessly swiping on Tinder when I matched with someone, Lori. Her photos were natural and unfiltered, long dark hair, a slightly pale but attractive face. There wasn't much information on her profile, but that mystery intrigued me. We started chatting, and she was quick-witted, confident, and engaging. After just a few messages, she suggested we meet. There's an old bar in the Lower East Side, Crimson Lounge. Let's meet there at 9. Sound good? New York is full of bars, but I had never heard of this one. I Googled it and found very little information. It was described as having a gothic, vintage atmosphere. But what really caught my eye were a few strange reviews. The bartenders give you weird looks. There's an unsettling vibe here. It's hard to remember things after drinking here. I didn't think much of it. It was New York. Every bar had its quirks. I agreed to meet her. The date. I arrived at Crimson Lounge around 8:45. It was a dimly lit brick building with Gothic details. There was something eerie about it, but I told myself it was just the ambiance. The moment I stepped inside, I realized it was quieter than I expected. For a Saturday night, the place was almost empty. A few scattered patrons sat in silence, barely speaking. Lori was sitting at a corner table. As soon as she spotted me, she smiled slightly and raised her hand. As I sat down, the first thing I noticed was her eyes. Deep, unreadable, like she was hiding something. "I knew you'd come," she said. That was an odd thing to say, but I brushed it off. Maybe she was just confident. At first, everything seemed normal. We had a few drinks, chatted, but the longer we talked, the more uneasy I felt. Lori would say things that sent a chill down my spine. Sometimes people disappear and no one ever knows where they went. People think they know someone, but they never really do. I laughed and joked. "What? Are you a serial killer?" She giggled, but her eyes didn't. "You have no idea how serious that question is." A weird comment, but I was starting to feel the alcohol. Maybe I was overthinking it. Then, without me ordering, the bartender brought us 2 drinks. "On the house," he said in a flat voice. I glanced at the drink. It looked normal, but something inside me screamed, "Don't drink it." Lori picked up her glass, took a small sip, and smiled at me. "What's wrong? Don't trust me?" I held the drink in my hand, but didn't take a sip. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something inside Lori's bag. It was slightly open, and I could see a wallet, a man's wallet, and there was a name on it. Daniel Carter. My stomach dropped. Lori quickly closed her bag, but she knew I had seen it. She leaned in and, in a low voice, said, "I think you're asking too many questions, Jake." That's when I knew I had to get out. The escape. I reached into my pocket and checked my phone. Quickly, I Googled Daniel Carter, New York, missing. And what I saw made my blood run cold. Daniel Carter had gone missing 2 weeks ago. The last place he was seen. A bar. But no one had mentioned which one. Just then, Lori locked eyes with me. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice no longer playful. It was cold, distant, controlling. I stood up. "I think I should go." Lori's smile faded. Her expression darkened. "I think you should sit down, Jake." It wasn't a request. It was a command. But I had already made up my mind. As I backed away from the table, I noticed something else. 2 men who had been sitting quietly the entire time suddenly stood up. They had been watching me. My heart started racing. This was a setup. I turned toward the door, but Lori leaned back in her chair, smirking. "You really think you're leaving tonight?" I ignored her. My legs moved on their own. The moment I took a step forward, I heard footsteps behind me. I was only a few meters from the door when I felt a strong hand grab my shoulder. I reacted instinctively, twisting to the side, knocking into a chair, barely keeping my balance, but I didn't stop. I burst out the door, cold air hitting my face. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the street corner. Only then did I turn back. Lori and the 2 men stood in the doorway of Crimson Lounge, watching me. They didn't chase me. They didn't yell. They just smiled. And that smile told me everything. "You got away tonight, but we're still here." When I got home, I called the police, but they did nothing. No security cameras, no evidence of a crime. There's nothing we can do. But since that night, I've been paying closer attention to the news, and just last week, I saw a headline. "Another man missing in New York. The last place he was seen. Crimson Lounge." I deleted Tinder that night, but sometimes I still get texts from unknown numbers